She burned the letter at 3 in the morning, stood right there in her dead father's kitchen, held the corner of that paper over the candle flame, and watched her uncle's ultimatum curl black and fall apart into ash. Her hands did not shake, her eyes did not water. She had already done her crying, done it for 3 weeks straight, after they lowered her father into the ground, and now there was nothing left inside her chest but something cold and sharp and absolutely certain. She was not going to sign. She was not going to let Nathaniel Crowe walk through her father's door, sit down at her father's table, and take everything her father had built with 30 years of bleeding, aching, honest work. She was not going to do it, but she also knew, standing there in the dark, watching the last corner of that letter turn to gray flakes, that knowing what she would not do was a very different thing from knowing what she could do. And right now, Eliza Hartwell could not do much at all. Before we go any further, if this story is already pulling at something inside you, I want you to hit that subscribe button right now and turn on your notifications. Stories like Eliza's don't get told enough, and I put my heart into every single one. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's get back to Eliza, standing in the dark, with ash on her fingers and 4 days left before everything she loved could be taken from her. The morning after she burned the letter, Eliza Hartwell sat down at the same kitchen table where her father had taught her to read land documents before she was 10 years old. She spread out every paper she owned across the worn oak surface. Deeds, survey maps, water rights, cattle records going back 15 years. Her father's original homestead filing, so creased and soft from handling that it felt almost like cloth. She read through all of it twice. Then she made a list of every legal argument she could construct in her own favor. It was not a short list. Eliza was not a stupid woman. She had never been a stupid woman, and it had taken her 23 years of living in a world that preferred her quiet to understand that being intelligent and being heard were two entirely separate things. She set down her pen. She looked at the list. She knew what she was up against. Her uncle had money. He had relationships with half the merchants in Willow Creek, and he had spent years building the kind of slow, patient influence that men like him always built, the kind that didn't announce itself loudly. Just accumulated quietly in the background until one day you looked around and realized it was everywhere. He had spoken to Judge Harlan already. Eliza knew this because Mrs. Aldridge at the dry goods store had mentioned it with the careful, sideways diplomacy of a woman who wanted to pass along a warning without ever being caught doing it. "Your uncle was in talking with Judge Harlan for quite a long time yesterday afternoon," she had said, keeping her eyes on the bolt of calico she was measuring. Quite a long time. Eliza had thanked her and walked out of the store and stood in the middle of the main street of Willow Creek with the sun cutting down hard on her shoulders, and she had thought, 4 days. She had 4 days before the guardianship hearing. 4 days before Nathaniel Crowe stood up in front of Judge Harlan and told the court that his poor, grieving, incapable niece needed someone to manage her affairs and that he was the only family she had left. And that, of course, he would be willing to take on that burden, painful as it was. She had gone home and read her documents twice more and made her list and known, in the honest, quiet part of herself where she did not allow self-deception, that the list was not going to be enough. The law in 1882 in the Montana Territory was not cruel to women the way a man with a raised fist was cruel. It was cruel the way weather was cruel, impersonal. Consistent, simply not designed with her in mind. A woman could own property. That was true. A woman could, in theory, stand before court and argue her own case. But a woman standing alone with no male voice beside hers, in front of a judge who had been sitting in that courtroom for 20 years and who had spent the previous afternoon in private conversation with her uncle, that woman was fighting uphill on wet ground in the dark. She needed something else. She needed something Nathaniel had not thought to prepare for. She sat at the table until the candle burned low and the kitchen went gray, with the early light coming through the window. She thought about her options with the same methodical patience her father had taught her. Don't panic, Eliza. Panic is just thinking fast in the wrong direction. and she went through every possibility she could construct and set each one aside when she found its flaw. She could go to the county sheriff, but Sheriff Breckett was a decent man who would listen politely and explain also politely that no crime had been committed yet. Her uncle had made threats. He had filed a legal petition. None of that was a crime. She could ask Reverend Morse to speak on her behalf. But Reverend Morse was 70 years old, and his voice carried no legal weight whatsoever. And besides, he had already told her privately that he did not think it wise for a young woman to be living and working a ranch on her own. He meant it kindly. She had thanked him and left. She could contact her father's old business partner, James Whitfield, in Billings. But Whitfield was 2 days' ride away, and the hearing was in 4 days, and even if she sent a telegram tonight, there was no certainty he would come, and she was not going to build her entire defense on a maybe. She sat with the gray light growing around her, and then she thought of Colton Reeves. She sat with the thought for a long time before she allowed herself to take it seriously. Because it was, she understood that clearly, a desperate idea. The kind of idea that you only arrive at when you have eliminated everything else. Colton Reeves owned Lone Creek Ranch, 11 miles northeast of town, in the open grassland country where the foothills began to soften toward the valley. He had owned it for going on 8 years, running cattle and keeping to himself with a consistency that people in Willow Creek had long since stopped finding mysterious and simply accepted as his nature. He came into town for supplies maybe once a month. He did his business quietly. He paid what he owed, asked for nothing, and left. People said various things about him in the way that small towns always have opinions about the people they don't fully understand. They said he was cold. They said something had happened to him before he came to Willow Creek, some loss or some bitterness, and that he had never recovered from it. They said he had no use for people in general, and less use for women in particular. Though nobody could point to any specific evidence of this, it was more the kind of assumption that attached itself to a quiet man, because his quietness made people uncomfortable, and discomfort always needed an explanation. But there were 2 things that nobody disputed about Colton Reeves. The first was that he was honest, not politely honest. Not strategically honest. Honest the way a stone wall was solid, not because it was trying to be, but because that was simply what it was made of. A man could go to Colton Reeves with a handshake deal and sleep well that night, and everyone in the county knew it. The second was that Nathaniel Crow had tried twice to involve Colton in one of his land arrangements, and Colton had turned him down both times with a flatness that had apparently left Nathaniel flustered in a way he didn't know how to handle. Nathaniel was a man who was very good at managing other people's perceptions of him. And Colton Reeves was a man who simply did not care about anyone's perceptions of anything, which made him, Eliza understood, nearly impossible for someone like her uncle to maneuver around. She stood up from the table. She did not let herself think too hard about what she was about to do, because she understood herself well enough to know that if she thought too hard, she would talk herself out of it. And she could not afford to talk herself out of anything right now. She went to her room. She packed a small bag, her father's most important documents, wrapped in oilcloth, tucked at the bottom, a change of clothes on top, the small amount of cash she kept hidden under the floorboard beneath the wardrobe. She went to the barn and saddled her mare in the dark, talking quietly to the animal the way her father had always talked to horses, low and steady, like you were explaining something rather than commanding. She rode out before sunrise. The land was still black and cool when she left, and she rode through the dark with the documents pressing against her hip through the side of the bag, and she thought about her father, not the grief of him being gone. She couldn't afford that right now, but the fact of him, the particular quality of his presence, the way he had always moved through difficulty with a kind of determined calm that she had spent her life trying to learn. You are your father's daughter, she told herself. She rode. By the time the sky began to lighten at the horizon, she could see the shape of Lone Creek Ranch coming up ahead, the dark line of the fence, the bulk of the barn, the low, solid shape of the house set back from the road. She stopped at the gate. She sat there on her horse in the early light and felt, for the first time since she had made this decision, the full weight of what she was about to do. the absurdity of it, the desperation of it. She was going to ride up to a man she had spoken to perhaps 4 times in her entire life and ask him to marry her. "Lord," she said quietly to no one in particular. Then she opened the gate and rode in. She had barely dismounted when the front door of the house opened. Colton Reeves stepped out onto the porch. He was a tall man, broad across the shoulders in the way that came from actual work rather than performance, with dark hair gone gray at the temples and a face that would have been handsome if it had ever learned to arrange itself into an accessible expression. He was already dressed. He had apparently been up for some time, and he stood on that porch and looked at her with an expression that was not exactly unwelcoming, and not exactly welcoming either. Careful, that was the word. The expression of a man who had learned to be careful about what he let in. "Miss Hartwell," he said. "Mr. Reeves." She tied her horse to the fence post and walked toward the porch. Her heart was moving fast, but her stride was not, and she was grateful for that small mercy. "I apologize for coming at this hour. Sun's up," he said, which was true, barely. "You want coffee?" Yes, thank you." She followed him inside. The interior of the house was not what she expected, though she was not sure afterward what exactly she had expected. It was clean, spare. Everything in it had a clear purpose and was in the place where it belonged. There was a large table with papers on it, ranch records, from the look of them, and a stone fireplace, and a kitchen area where a coffee pot sat on the stove putting out a thin thread of steam. He poured 2 cups, set one in front of her, sat down on the opposite side of the table with the other, and looked at her with those careful eyes. "You're Robert Hartwell's daughter," he said. "Yes." "He was a good man." "Yes," she said he was. A silence. Colton wrapped both hands around his cup. "Your uncle's filed a petition," he said. It wasn't a question. Eliza looked at him. "You know about it." "I hear things," he paused. "I hear things about your uncle in general." "Then you know what he's trying to do." "I know what men like Nathaniel Crowe always try to do," Colton said quietly. "Doesn't take much imagination." Eliza set down her cup. She had made a decision, riding here in the dark, that she was going to be direct. No approaching it sideways, no building up to it with careful maneuvering. This man had no patience for maneuvering. She had understood that much from a distance, and she did not have time for it anyway. "I have 4 days before the hearing," she said. "I have evidence that my uncle has been falsifying land documents, but I need time to build the case properly, and the court is not going to give that time to a woman who's standing alone. My uncle has influence with Judge Harlan. He has witnesses prepared. He has a story built that makes me sound incapable and grieving and unable to manage my own affairs. And the unfortunate thing is that some of what he says will land credibly because I am grieving and I am." She paused, made herself be honest, frightened. And frightened and grieving look like incapable to a court that's already inclined to see it that way. Colton was watching her, not with pity, with attention. "What I need," Eliza said, "is a husband. Someone whose name beside mine in a legal document changes the calculation. Someone my uncle cannot buy, cannot pressure, and cannot manage." She looked at him straight. "Someone whose honesty nobody in this county would question." The silence that followed was the longest 11 seconds of Eliza Hartwell's life. Colton Reeves looked at her across the table. His expression had not changed exactly, but something behind it had shifted. Some internal adjustment she couldn't quite read. "You're asking me to marry you," he said. "I'm asking you to enter into a legal marriage with me for the purpose of protecting my legal standing before the court. I'm aware of how it sounds. I'm aware that it's an extraordinary thing to ask of someone." She kept her voice level. "I'm also aware that I have very few choices left and that you are, based on everything I know about you, the right person to ask." Another silence. "Why me specifically?" he said. "There are other men in Willow Creek." "There are other men," she agreed. "Most of them already have opinions about me, or about my uncle, or about what my father's land is worth. Most of them can be influenced. You can't." She paused. "Also, you turned my uncle down twice already. He won't have a script for this." Something moved through Colton's expression. Almost possibly the ghost of something that was not quite amusement, but was in the same neighborhood. "You've thought this through," he said. "I've been thinking since 3 this morning." He looked down at his coffee, looked at the papers on the table. Looked back at her. What happens after, he said. After the hearing, we discuss the terms. I have the ranch. I intend to keep working it. I would not make claims on yours. She folded her hands on the table. I would want a clear and honest agreement about what this marriage is and what it isn't. I think that's fair to both of us, and if I say no? The question landed quietly. Eliza looked at him and did not let herself look away. Then I go home, she said. I fight as best I can on my own. And I probably was quiet. Eliza waited. Outside, a morning bird started up somewhere near the barn, a clear, high sound in the early light. Yes, Colton said, just the one word, no preamble. No list of conditions, no demand for more explanation. Just yes. Eliza stared at him. That's you're certain, she said, and hated herself immediately for giving him the opportunity to reconsider, but she couldn't help it. The word had landed so cleanly, so quickly, that her mind could not immediately arrange itself around it. I said yes, Colton said. I don't generally say things I don't mean. No, she managed. No, I don't suppose you do. He stood up. Refilled his coffee cup. Set the pot back on the stove with the same unhurried deliberateness he apparently brought to everything. Town judge performs marriages, he said without turning around. We can ride in this morning. Get it done before your uncle hears about it. Yes, Eliza said, that would be yes. He turned back to face her. And for just a moment, a brief, unguarded moment, she saw something cross his face that was not quite the careful blankness he wore like a second skin. Something older, something that had been sitting in him for a long time. Nobody should have to lose what's theirs, he said quietly, because they didn't have anyone in their corner. Then the expression settled back into its usual steadiness, and he picked up his hat from the hook beside the door. We should get moving, he said. Eliza stood. Picked up her bag, felt the weight of her father's documents against her hand through the oilcloth. Mr. Reeves, she said. He paused the door. Thank you, she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded once and held the door open. They rode into Willow Creek as the town was waking up, smoke beginning to curl from chimneys, the clang of the blacksmiths starting early misses. Aldridge turning her sign in the window of the dry goods store. People noticed. Of course people noticed. Willow Creek was not a large town, and Colton Reeves riding in beside a woman was unusual enough to pull eyes, and when they stopped in front of Judge Emmett Pearson's office, Judge Pearson handled county civil matters. Judge Harlan handled the circuit court hearings. The small cluster of men outside Dawson's Hardware turned to look. Colton dismounted, came around without being asked and offered his hand to help Eliza down. She took it, firm grip, warm, let go the moment she was steady on the ground. He held the door to Pearson's office open. Inside, behind a desk stacked with papers and ledgers, Judge Emmett Pearson looked up over his reading spectacles at the two people who had just walked through his door at 7:45 in the morning. Colton Reeves, he said, with the tone of a man who had long since given up being surprised by anything. Judge Pearson. Colton set his hat on the edge of the desk. We'd like to get married. Pearson looked at Eliza. Looked back at Colton, pushed his spectacles up his nose. That's so, he said. Yes, sir, Colton said. I'll need the ladies. Eliza Margaret Hartwell, Eliza said, Robert Hartwell's daughter. Born here in Willow Creek, September 14th, 1859. Pearson wrote it down. He was a careful man who liked to do things properly, and he moved through the paperwork with an attention to detail that under other circumstances Eliza might have appreciated more. As it was, she stood beside Colton in the small, paper-filled office and watched the morning light come through the single window, and tried to understand that this was real, that she was actually doing this. That in approximately 12 minutes she would be legally married to a man she had spoken to, perhaps 5 times in her life. Colton stood still beside her. He did not fidget, he did not look uncomfortable. He looked exactly as he always looked, contained. Present, like a man who had made a decision and was simply carrying it out. All right, Judge Pearson said, setting down his pen and standing. Shall we proceed? They stood in front of the judge's desk. The window light fell across the floor between them. "Do you, Colton James Reeves, take this woman as your lawful wedded wife?" "Yes," Colton said, without waiting for the end of the sentence. Judge Pearson blinked. Eliza felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't known was clenched. To have and to hold. From this day forward, Pearson finished, clearly a man who intended to complete the sentence he had started. For better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part. "Yes," Colton said again, "and do you, Eliza Margaret Hartwell, take this man as your lawful wedded husband?" "I do," Eliza said. Her voice was steady. She was grateful for that. Pearson looked between them. "Rings?" he said. "No," Colton said. "Just the document." Pearson wrote the certificate out by hand, in his careful, precise script, and signed it, and pressed his official seal to the bottom of it, and handed it across the desk. Colton took it, looked at it for a moment, handed it to Eliza. She looked down at the paper, the ink still slightly wet. Her name and Colton's name together in Pearson's careful handwriting, and the date and the seal. "Legal, real, done. Congratulations," Pearson said, in the tone of a man who was not entirely sure congratulations was the right word but was going to say it anyway because it was the customary thing. "I trust the county business regarding the Hartwell estate will be proceeding through the proper channels." "It will," Eliza said. "Good." Pearson sat back down. "Good, you can see yourselves out." They walked out into the morning street. The sun was fully up now, the sky gone from gray to a clean, sharp blue. 3 separate people had stopped moving entirely to watch them emerge from Judge Pearson's office, and Eliza was aware, with a clarity that was almost funny, that within the hour every single person in Willow Creek was going to know what had just happened in there. Including Nathaniel Crow. "He'll hear about this quickly," she said. "Yes," Colton said. He was looking out at the street with an expression she was beginning to recognize, not distant exactly, but measuring. Taking the landscape, social or physical, and accounting for what was in it. "He won't be pleased," she said. "No," Colton said. "He won't." He looked at her. "You ready to go back to the ranch?" he said. "You should rest. I'm guessing you haven't slept." "I'm fine, Miss Hartwell, Mrs. Reeves," she said, and then stopped, because the words had come out of her mouth before she had decided to say them, automatic and slightly startling to both of them. A pause. "Mrs. Reeves," Colton said in a tone she could not quite read. "You haven't slept. You rode 11 miles in the dark on a plan that required a stranger to agree on very short notice. You should rest. There's still the evidence to organize," she said. "The documents will still be there in 4 hours." He picked up her horse's reins from the post and held them out to her. "The evidence won't be worth much if the person presenting it is too exhausted to present it clearly. Your father taught you to read land records. I'm guessing he also taught you how to think straight." Eliza looked at him. "You're right," she said after a moment. It cost her something to say it, and she suspected he understood that. He nodded. Just once. They rode out of Lone Creek side back toward Lone Creek Ranch, while behind them the town's morning conversations were just beginning to include their names. At the edge of town, where the road curved around a stand of cottonwoods and the buildings fell away behind, Eliza allowed herself to look down again at the marriage certificate. Folded now, and tucked into the front pocket of her bag where she could feel it with her hand. Paper and ink and a seal, the most unlikely protection she had ever held. She thought about her uncle waking up this morning, confident, starting his day with the comfortable certainty of a man who believed he had already won. She thought about the moment he was going to hear what had happened in Judge Pearson's office this morning. She thought about Colton saying yes before the sentence was finished. Nobody should have to lose what's theirs, because they didn't have anyone in their corner. She looked sideways at the man riding beside her, steady in the saddle, looking ahead, quiet as he always was, and she thought, "Who are you, really? Colton Reeves?" She didn't know, but she had 4 days to find out. And somewhere in those 4 days, the shape of everything between them was going to be decided, not just what this marriage was, but what it might become. Not just whether she could hold on to her father's land, but whether she could hold on to herself in the process. The horses moved steadily through the morning grass. The sky stretched out ahead of them, wide and clean and full of all the things that hadn't happened yet. They were halfway back to Lone Creek Ranch when Eliza heard the horse behind them. She didn't turn around immediately. She had been raised on a working ranch, and she knew the difference between a horse moving at a casual pace and a horse being pushed. This one was being pushed, hard, coming up fast from the direction of town. Colton heard it too. She could tell by the way his shoulders shifted just slightly, just enough. He turned first. "Don't look," he said quietly. "Keep riding." "Who is it?" Crane Mulvey, Colton said. "Your uncle's man." Eliza knew the name. Everyone in Willow Creek knew Crane Mulvey, a thick-necked, small-eyed man who did the kind of work for Nathaniel Crow that Nathaniel preferred not to do himself. He wasn't a hired gun exactly. He was something more insidious than that. He was the person Nathaniel sent when he wanted someone frightened, without any evidence that he'd done the frightening. "Keep riding," Colton said again. "I'm not afraid of Crane Mulvey." "I know you're not. Keep riding anyway." The hoofbeats closed the distance, and Mulvey pulled his horse up alongside them with the aggressive ease of a man who was very comfortable making himself a problem. "Reeves," he said, not a greeting, an announcement. Colton did not look at him. "Mulvey, heard something interesting this morning." Mulvey's eyes slid to Eliza with the particular quality of a look designed to make a person feel assessed and found wanting. "Heard you two paid a visit to Judge Pearson. Word travels fast," Colton said. "Mr. Crow wanted me to pass along his congratulations." The word congratulations carried about as much warmth as a January fence post. "He also wanted me to mention that a rushed marriage isn't going to change the legal situation with the estate. The petition's already been filed. Judge Harlan's already been briefed." "Thank your employer for the information," Colton said. "He also wanted to mention," Mulvey continued, as though Colton hadn't spoken, "that it would be a shame for a man of your reputation to get himself tangled up in something messy. You've got a good ranch, good standing. Seems like a lot to risk over someone else's family trouble." Colton stopped his horse. Mulvey stopped too, looking satisfied, apparently reading the pause as hesitation. Colton turned and looked at him for the first time. The look was not angry. It was not aggressive. It was the look of a man who was telling you something and wanted you to understand he was only going to tell you once. "Mulvey," he said, "I'm going to say this plainly because I think you're the kind of man who does better with plain language. What your employer wants and what he's going to get are two different things. You can ride back to town and tell him that, or you can keep talking and waste more of my morning. Either way, we're done here." Mulvey's jaw tightened. "You're making a mistake," he said. "Probably not," Colton said. He clicked to his horse and started forward again. Eliza followed. After a long moment, Mulvey's hoofbeats moved back toward town. Neither of them spoke for almost a full minute. Then Eliza said, "He's going straight to my uncle." "Yes," Colton said. "Nathaniel will change his approach. Whatever he had planned, he'll adjust now, yes. That could be good or bad, depending on what he decides." Colton glanced at her sideways. "You think fast. I was raised to," she said. "My father used to say that the person who thinks second always fights on someone else's ground." Something shifted in Colton's expression, not quite a smile. "Something quieter than that. Your father sounds like he was worth knowing." "He was," Eliza said, and she felt the grief move through her clean and sharp and real, and then she set it aside, the way she had been setting it aside for 3 weeks, because she could not afford it yet. There would be time for grief later. If she won, she would grieve properly. That was the deal she had made with herself. They reached Lone Creek Ranch before 8 in the morning. Colton showed her to a room at the end of the hall, spare, clean, a bed with a wool blanket and a window that looked out toward the east pasture. She noticed he had put a fresh towel on the chair beside the washstand without her asking. "Sleep," he said from the doorway. "I'll wake you at noon." "The documents, I'll look at them while you sleep," he said. "You showed me which bag they're in?" She had. On the ride back, she had pointed to the oilcloth parcel in the side pocket of the saddlebag, explained quickly what each document was, which ones mattered most and why. "You'll understand them?" "I've been reading land records since I was 18 years old," Colton said. "Get some sleep, Mrs. Reeves." There was that name again, coming from his mouth in that quiet, matter-of-fact way, like it was already something real. She looked at him standing in the doorway, this strange, steady man who had turned her world over in the space of one morning, by saying a single word, and she didn't know what to say. "Thank you," she said again. It felt insufficient, but it was what she had. "Stop thanking me," he said, not unkindly. "Get some sleep." He pulled the door closed. She sat on the edge of the bed and felt the exhaustion hit her all at once, the way it always did when the urgency stepped back for a moment. And she thought, "What have you done, Eliza?" Then she thought the right thing, the only thing. She lay down on top of the blanket, still in her riding clothes, and was asleep in under 3 minutes. She woke to voices, not loud, not arguing, but voices in the front room of the house, and something about the quality of them pulled her up through sleep fast, the way she had always been able to wake quickly when something needed attending to. Her father used to say she slept like a ranch hand, which he had meant as a compliment. She was on her feet and at the door before she was fully awake. Through the slight gap she could see into the front room. Colton was at the table with her documents spread before him, but he was no longer alone. Across from him sat a man she didn't recognize, immediately older, heavyset, with a gray beard and a careful way of holding himself that suggested someone accustomed to rooms where decisions were being made. And beside that man, standing rather than sitting, was someone she did recognize. Chester Finley, her uncle's attorney. Her hand found the doorframe. Finley was a narrow man in an expensive suit, who had the particular quality of a person whose intelligence was deployed entirely in service of whoever was paying him. He was not dishonest exactly. He was precisely as honest as the situation required, and not a degree more. "Mr. Reeves," Finley was saying, "I want to be clear that I'm not here on behalf of any adversarial interest. I'm here in a spirit of resolution. You're here because Nathaniel Crowe sent you," Colton said. He did not look up from the documents. "My client has certain concerns about the suddenness of this morning's events. He is, after all, Eliza's only living family. His interest in her welfare is genuine." "His interest in her land is genuine," Colton said. "His interest in her welfare is whatever's useful." Finley paused, adjusted his approach. "My client is prepared to be generous. He understands that Miss Hartwell, Mrs. Reeves, has been under considerable stress since her father's passing. He is prepared to offer her a settlement, a fair share of the ranch's value in cash, allowing her to." "No," Colton said. The word landed with the same quality as a door closing. Finley tried again. "Mr. Reeves, with respect, this isn't your dispute. You've been married for approximately 2 hours. The legal complexity here." "Chester." Colton set down the paper he was holding and looked at Finley directly for the first time. "I've read through 6 of these documents this morning. You know what I found?" Finley's expression shifted. Just barely. A tightening around the eyes. "I found a deed of transfer dated March of 1879, Colton said. Hartwell land, 40 acres on the east boundary, transferred to a holding company called Crowe and Associates. Signed by Robert Hartwell." He paused. "Except Robert Hartwell was in Billings in March of 1879. I know because he sent me a letter from Billings in March of 1879 asking about winter grazing arrangements." "Which means that signature isn't his." The room went very quiet. Eliza's hand tightened on the door frame. Finley said nothing for a long moment. "That's a serious allegation," he said carefully. "It's a serious document," Colton said. "You want to take it back to your client and explain to him that I found it. Or would he prefer to hear about it for the first time in front of Judge Harlan?" The older man with the gray beard had not spoken at all. Now he shifted in his chair, and something about the movement made Eliza look at him more carefully. He was watching Colton with an expression she could not quite read, not alarmed exactly, but attentive in a way that felt significant. "Who are you?" she said, opening the door fully and stepping into the room. 3 heads turned. Colton looked at her without the surprise she suspected he had known she was there. Finley looked at her with the expression of a man recalibrating quickly. The older man looked at her with something that might have been recognition. Mrs. Reeves Finley said, recovering smoothly. Was just... I heard what you were doing, Eliza said. She crossed the room and stood beside the table, beside Colton. She noticed, without deciding to, just positioning herself naturally in the space. Who is this man? Thomas Aldgate, the man said, before Finley could answer. His voice was measured. I was a land agent in this territory from 1871 to 1878. I worked with your father on several transactions. He paused. I also worked briefly with your uncle. The way he said it briefly carried weight. Why are you here? Eliza said. Aldgate glanced at Finley. Then he looked back at Eliza and made what was clearly a decision. I came with Chester because he asked me to come, Aldgate said. He told me it was to help resolve a family misunderstanding. He paused again. I don't think that's what this is. Thomas Finley started. I have documents, Aldgate said to Eliza, from my time as a land agent. Records of transactions your uncle asked me to assist with. Another pause. Transactions I refused because they weren't legal. I kept copies of everything. I kept them because I thought they might matter someday. He looked down at his hands. I suppose someday is today, Eliza stared at him. Finley stood up so fast his chair scraped back hard against the floor. Thomas, I'm advising you strongly. You're not my attorney, Aldgate said quietly. This could expose you to Chester. Aldgate looked at him with the particular patience of an older man who has made his peace with something. I'm 63 years old. I've been carrying this for 7 years. I'm tired of carrying it. He looked back at Eliza. Your father was a good man. I knew it then. Your uncle used him, and I didn't do enough to stop it, and I have lived with that. He took a breath. I'm not going to live with it anymore. Chester Finley picked up his hat from the table. I'll see myself out, he said. The words were controlled, but underneath them was something jagged. Mr. Reeves, Mrs. Reeves. He did not look at Aldgate. This conversation will have consequences. I imagine it will, Colton said. Finley left. The door shut behind him, and the sound of his horse leaving the yard followed a moment later, fast and hard in the way that communicated displeasure more clearly than any words. The three of them sat in the quiet that remained, Mr. Aldgate, Eliza said carefully. I need to understand what you have. All of it. Yes, Aldgate said, I know. He reached into the interior pocket of his coat and produced a folded packet of papers. Set them on the table. Looked at her. Your uncle started in 1876, he said. That's as far back as I can document directly. He was using a variation of what they call a ghost transfer, creating paperwork that mimicked legitimate transactions, getting it filed through agents who didn't look closely enough, or who were paid not to. He didn't take the land outright. He was smarter than that. He transferred portions, small ones, 40 acres here, 20 acres there, always to holding companies that existed on paper but had no real presence. Then the holding companies sold to real buyers, and by the time anyone questioned it, the chain of paperwork was long enough that tracing it back required the kind of sustained attention that most county courts don't have time for. He paused. How many families? Colton asked. Aldgate looked at the table. That I know of directly? 6, but there were others I suspected. I didn't have documentation for those. 6 families, Eliza said. Yes, she thought about 6 families. 6 sets of people who had built something, cleared land, worked it, lived on it, maybe buried people they loved on it and had pieces of it quietly carved away. 6 sets of people who had probably never understood exactly what happened. We need to get you to the courthouse, she said. We need to get your statement on record before the hearing. I know, Aldgate said. That's why I'm here. I came with Chester thinking it was well. It doesn't matter what I thought. I'm here now and I know what I need to do. He looked at Colton. You found the March 1879 deed yourself, he said. This morning, Colton said. 2 hours with the documents. Aldgate nodded slowly. You would have found the others too. There are 3 more in that stack, if I'm right about what Nathaniel kept doing. He gestured toward the papers. May I? Colton pushed the documents toward him. Aldgate went through them with the efficient hands of a man who knew exactly what he was looking for. Within 4 minutes, he had extracted 3 additional papers and laid them out in a row. "Here," he said, "here and here." He tapped each one. "Same pattern, Ghost Holding Company. Signature that doesn't match Robert Hartwell's other signatures. Look at the way the R is formed. It's different every time a forger does it, because they're working from memory rather than habit." He looked at Eliza. "Your father signed his name the same way every single time for 30 years. The muscle memory of it. These signatures don't have that." Eliza looked at the papers, at her father's name, not her father's name, written in a slightly wrong hand, on documents that had been filed and recorded, and had been sitting in official county records for years, doing their quiet damage. She felt something rise in her chest that was not grief and not anger, but some compound of both, older and harder than either. "He did this while my father was alive," she said. "Yes," Aldgate said, "my father trusted him, I know." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, with a steadiness that surprised her, "All right. We have 4 documents with forged signatures. We have your testimony about the broader pattern. What else do we need?" Colton leaned back in his chair and looked at her. "The ledger." She looked at him. "What ledger?" Aldgate mentioned payments, Colton said. He looked at the former land agent. "You said you kept records of transactions you refused. Did that include payment records, evidence of money changing hands?" Aldgate hesitated. This was a different kind of hesitation than before, not moral but tactical. He was calculating something. "There was a ledger," he said slowly. "Kept by a man named Harwick, Joel Harwick. He was another land agent, worked this territory same time I did. He handled more of the actual transactional side than I did. He kept meticulous records. It was actually a professional habit with him. He recorded everything. He didn't know what Nathaniel was doing at first. By the time he understood, the records he'd kept had become evidence against his own involvement, and he was frightened." "Where is he?" said. "He left the territory in '78, Aldgate said. Went to Oregon. I lost track of him." Eliza looked at Colton. She could see him thinking the same steady, methodical quality he seemed to bring to everything, the same unhurried accounting. "Harwick would have filed official records too," Colton said slowly. "If he was the transactional agent, which means his ledger might match against county filings." "It would," Aldgate confirmed, "if we had the ledger." "We might not need the ledger itself," Colton said. He stood up and went to the far end of the room, to an old wooden cabinet against the wall, and opened it. Inside were stacked boxes of papers, ranch records. From the look of them, years of them, going back to the early days of Lone Creek. "What are you looking for?" Eliza said. "Give me a minute." He went through the boxes with the same unhurried precision, pulling papers, setting them aside, pulling more. Eliza watched him. Aldgate watched him. Nobody spoke. After 6 minutes, Colton pulled out a small worn notebook and held it up. "Harwick did business with my family," he said, "years before I took over the ranch. My father kept records of every transaction. It's how I was raised." He opened the notebook. "Harwick's receipts would be in here. If those receipts match against the forged Hartwell transfers, same dates, same holding companies, that's a paper trail that doesn't require Harwick himself." Eliza stared at the notebook. "Your father's record," she said. "He kept everything," Colton said. "I thought it was excessive at the time." He sat back down and opened the notebook on the table beside the other documents. "Let's find out if it matters." They worked for the next 3 hours without stopping. Eliza had thought she knew what concentrated effort felt like. She had organized her father's estate papers, managed complex cattle records, worked through legal documents that would have bewildered most people she knew. But this was different. This was 3 people pulling on threads simultaneously, and every thread that connected told a story, and the story was getting larger and more damning with every new connection. Aldgate knew the transactional language. Eliza knew her father's records. Colton knew his own ranch history, and it became clear quickly had a mind that moved through numbers and document sequences with a lateral, connecting quality that was genuinely remarkable. At one point she looked up and caught Aldgate watching Colton with an expression of quiet assessment. You didn't go into law, Aldgate said to him. It wasn't quite a question. No, Colton said without looking up. You should have. Maybe, Colton said. This works better. By mid-afternoon, they had constructed a chain of documentation that connected Nathaniel Crowe to 8 fraudulent land transfers spanning 6 years. 4 of them directly involved Eliza's family property. 4 others involved neighboring families, the Garretts, the Sanderson estate, the widow Pruitt, and a family named Okonkwo who had left the territory 2 years ago and whose departure, Eliza now understood, had probably not been entirely voluntary. She sat back in her chair and looked at what they had built. This is enough, she said. It's more than enough, Aldgate said quietly. It's enough to clear the estate, Colton said, and probably enough to open a broader investigation if the county attorney has any spine at all. Eliza looked at him. Do you know the county attorney? I know him. Does he have spine? A pause, some. Then we go to him today, Eliza said. Before Finley gets back to my uncle and before my uncle has time to do anything else. She looked at Aldgate. Are you willing to go to the county attorney with this? Tonight? Aldgate looked at the papers on the table. At the careful damning chain of evidence they had assembled across an afternoon. Yes, he said, I'm willing. They rode into Willow Creek for the second time that day, as the afternoon was moving toward evening, the light going golden and long across the grass. 3 riders, Eliza in the middle, Colton on her left, Aldgate on her right, the saddlebag with the documents between them. Eliza was aware of people watching as they moved down the main street. She was aware of the particular quality of a small town's attention, the way it tracked unusual configurations, the way it noticed who was riding with whom. She had been the subject of that attention her entire life in various forms, and she had never been able to entirely make herself indifferent to it. But today it felt different. Today she was not riding alone. She did not look for her uncle's office as they passed it. She didn't need to. She could feel the building's presence the way you felt a weather system coming, a pressure, a change in the air. The county attorney's office was at the far end of the main street, past the hardware and the bank and the telegraph office. Harrison Voss had held the position for 4 years. He was 38 years old, sharp-minded, politically careful in the way of a man who wanted a future in the law, and not as far as Eliza had ever been able to determine in Nathaniel Crowe's pocket. Not actively allied with him anyway, which was different from having spine, but it was a start. Voss was still in his office when they arrived, which was fortunate. He looked up at the 3 of them walking through his door, with the expression of a man who understood immediately that his evening had just become more complicated. Mrs. Reeves, he said, and the name landed strangely, but he moved past it. Mr. Reeves. He looked at Aldgate, Thomas Aldgate. I was a land agent in this territory, from 1871 to 1878. Voss looked at the saddlebag, looked at Eliza. I think, he said slowly, you should sit down. They sat down. Eliza opened the bag and laid the documents out on Voss's desk, and then she talked. Clearly, precisely. The way her father had taught her, don't perform, don't emote, just present the facts in the right order, and let the facts do the work. She talked for 20 minutes without interruption, and Aldgate added his testimony where it was needed, and Colton sat quietly beside her, and when she was done, Voss sat back in his chair and rubbed his face with both hands. How long have you had these documents, he said. The originals were in my father's files, Eliza said. I've had access to them since his death. I found the discrepancy in the March 1879 deed 2 days ago. We made the additional connections this afternoon. And you, Voss, looked at Aldgate. You're prepared to testify to this formally? Yes, Aldgate said. Voss was quiet for a long moment. Nathaniel Crowe has been in this county for 20 years, he said carefully. Yes, Eliza said. He has relationships. Significant ones. He does. Voss looked at her. He was doing the calculation she recognized, the calculation of risk, of what it would cost him to act, and what it would cost him to not act. She watched him doing it, and kept her expression level and waited. This evidence, he said finally, if it's what you say it is. Read the documents, Colton said. It was the first thing he'd said since they sat down, and the quality of his voice in the room quiet, direct. No patience for equivocation seemed to take Voss slightly aback. Voss pulled the papers toward him. He read for 12 minutes. Nobody spoke. The evening light moved across the window. Somewhere outside, a horse went by on the street. Voss set the papers down. "I'll need these overnight," he said. "No," Eliza said. He looked at her. "I will have copies made," she said. "Right now, before we leave this office, you can keep the copies." "I keep the originals," she paused. "I mean no disrespect to your office, Mr. Voss. But these are the only proof I have of what my father built and what was done to him, and I'm not leaving them anywhere I can't verify their safety." Voss held her gaze for a moment. Then he said, "There's a copier at the telegraph office." "If you'll wait, I can send my clerk." "We'll wait," Eliza said. Voss's clerk was back in 20 minutes with careful handwritten copies of every document. Eliza checked them against the originals, page by page, while Voss watched with an expression that had moved from careful political calculation into something that looked closer to genuine. When she was done, she handed Voss the copies, returned the originals to the oilcloth in her bag. Closed the bag. "The hearing is in 3 days," she said. "I'm aware," Voss said. "Will you be prepared?" Another long pause. "Yes," Voss said. Colton stood beside her. Aldgate pushed himself to his feet with the slight effortfulness of a man with old bones, and a weight he'd been carrying too long finally set partway down. They walked out into the evening street. The light was going now, the sky above the buildings going pink and orange, and the shadows stretching long, and Willow Creek was beginning its evening, settling the lamplighters starting their rounds. The saloon down the street picking up sound, families moving toward dinner. Eliza stood on the wooden sidewalk outside Voss's office and breathed. 3 days. She had everything she needed, or close to it. She had Aldgate's testimony. She had the documents. She had Voss preparing. She was aware of this with a clarity that still felt slightly unreal, a husband who had spent a full day working alongside her, as though there were nowhere else he had any intention of being. "You should eat something," Colton said beside her. "I know," she said. "You skipped breakfast and lunch." She looked at him sideways. "You noticed that. Hard not to," he said. "You were sitting 3 feet away from me for 4 hours." There was something in the matter-of-factness of it, the simple, unperformed quality of his attention to her, that did something unexpected to the space behind her breastbone. She didn't examine it. "Not now, Aldgate," she said, turning to the older man. "Where are you staying tonight?" "I was planning to get a room at the boarding house," Aldgate said. "Get a room," she said, "and don't go anywhere near my uncle or his associates tonight. If anyone approaches you, I've kept this secret for 7 years, Mrs. Reeves," Aldgate said, with a small, dry precision that she recognized as the particular dignity of an older man who didn't appreciate being managed. "I think I can manage 1 more night, of course," she said. "I'm sorry," he nodded, tipped his hat, started down the sidewalk. She and Colton stood there for a moment. "He'll be all right," she said quietly. "I'll ask Dawson to keep an eye on him," Colton said. "Dawson's Hardware is across from the boarding house. He's up late. He notices things. Do you have a network of people who notice things throughout this entire town?" she said. "I know who to trust," Colton said simply. "It's fewer people than you'd think, but they're reliable." They rode back to Lone Creek Ranch in the dark, and neither of them spoke much, and the silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people who had spent a day doing significant work together and were tired in the good, real way of people who have done what needed doing. It was only when they were unsaddling the horses in the barn, working in the lamplight on either side of the horses, that Nathaniel Crow's man appeared at the barn door. Not Mulvey this time, someone Eliza didn't recognize. Young, nondescript, with the careful blankness of a person who was there in a professional capacity. "Message for Mrs. Reeves," he said. Eliza looked at Colton. He was watching the young man with that measuring steadiness. "From my uncle," she said. "Yes, ma'am." She crossed the barn and took the folded paper from the young man's hand. He left immediately, no waiting for a response, no lingering. In out, she opened the letter. Her uncle's handwriting was beautiful. He had always had beautiful handwriting, the careful practiced script of a man who understood presentation. The letter was 3 paragraphs long. The first paragraph expressed his sorrow at the hasty, and the word was underlined, delicately unfortunate developments of the day. The second paragraph expressed his continued concern for her well-being, and his understanding that grief could cause people to make decisions that did not serve their own best interests. The third paragraph was very short. It said, "You have made a powerful enemy of the wrong person, Eliza. I suggest you consider carefully whether the ground you are standing on is as solid as you believe." She read it twice, then she folded it and looked up at Colton, who was watching her. "Threat," he said. "Suggestion," she said, delicately phrased. "Same thing," he said. "Yes," she said, "same thing." She turned the letter over in her hands, her uncle's beautiful handwriting on the outside. The careful threat inside. "He's frightened," she said. This morning he was confident, now he's frightened. "That makes him more dangerous," Colton said. "I know," Eliza said. "I know it does." She tucked the letter into her coat pocket, beside the marriage certificate, beside the oilcloth parcel with her father's documents. She looked at Colton across the back of her horse in the lamplight of his barn on the first day of what was legally their marriage. And she thought 3 more days. She thought, "I am my father's daughter." She thought, "I am not going to run." She didn't sleep that night. She tried. She lay on top of the blanket in the spare room at Lone Creek Ranch and stared at the ceiling and listened to the sounds of the house settling around her, the particular creaks and exhales of an old building. Breathing in the dark, and her mind would not stop moving. It kept pulling the threads, following the connections, running through scenarios for what Nathaniel might do with the time he had left before the hearing. A frightened man with money and influence and 3 days was not nothing. A frightened man with all of that and no remaining scruples was considerably worse than nothing. She was sitting at the kitchen table with her father's documents spread out again when she heard Colton's door open down the hall. His footsteps were quiet, but she had already learned the sound of them, a deliberate, unhurried rhythm that was entirely consistent with everything else about him. He came into the kitchen, stopped in the doorway when he saw her, and looked at her with an expression that managed to communicate both unsurprise and mild exasperation without arranging itself into anything so overt as either. "How long have you been up?" he said. "I'm not sure I went to sleep." He looked at the documents, looked at her, moved to the stove without another word and put coffee on. The normalcy of it, the simple domestic competence of a man who made coffee at 4 in the morning without drama, did something strange and settling to her nerves. "He's going to go after the witnesses," she said. "That's what I keep coming back to. He can't touch the documents now that Voss has copies. He can't undo what Aldgate knows. But if he can discredit Aldgate before the hearing, if he can find something in Aldgate's past, a business failure, a personal problem, anything, he can stand up in that courtroom and say the testimony comes from a compromised source." "Yes," Colton said, his back to her, watching the coffee pot. "Probably. Does Aldgate have anything in his past that could be used that way?" "I don't know his full history. We need to know before my uncle finds out first." Colton poured 2 cups, set one in front of her, sat down across the table. "I'll ride to town in the morning," he said. "Talk to Aldgate directly. He needs to know what's coming so he can prepare." "I want to come, I know," but Colton looked at her steadily. "But I think someone should stay here and contact James Whitfield in Billings. You mentioned him yesterday, your father's business partner." "I said he was 2 days away and the hearing is in 3 days," Colton said. 2 days away means he could arrive the night before. If he's willing to testify to your father's character and business practices, that's a second witness Nathaniel has to manage." He paused. "You said you didn't want to build your case on a maybe. I understand that, but right now we have room for a maybe. We should use it." She looked at him across the table. He was right. She knew he was right, which was a slightly uncomfortable sensation, because she had spent 3 weeks being the only person in any room who was thinking clearly, and having someone match her step for step was she didn't have a word for it yet. Steadying, disorienting, both at once. All right, she said. I'll send the telegram first thing. There's something else, Colton said. His tone had shifted. Not by much. His voice didn't operate in wide registers, but enough that she felt it, and she looked at him more carefully. What? She said. He reached into the inside pocket of his shirt and produced a folded piece of paper. Set it on the table between them. She looked at it. Looked at him. Where did that come from? My old ranch records. The cabinet in the front room. He pushed it slightly toward her. I found it this morning, while you were sleeping. She unfolded it. It was a letter old, the paper gone soft and slightly yellow at the folds. The handwriting was not Colton's. It was a woman's hand, she thought, or perhaps a man who had learned to write from a woman, something in the particular formation of the letters, suggesting someone who had been carefully taught. She read it twice. Then she set it down and looked at Colton. This is your mother's letter, she said. Yes. She wrote this to the land agent who handled your family's ranch. She looked at the date at the top of the letter. In 1874. Yes, she was appealing to him, asking him to. Eliza stopped. Read the relevant passage again. She was asking him to correct an error in a transfer document. A transfer of 40 acres of Lone Creek land, she looked up. To a holding company called Western Grazing Associates. Yes, Colton said. His voice was entirely level. His hands, she noticed, were very still around his coffee cup. Colton, she was choosing her words carefully now. Western Grazing Associates is one of the holding companies in Nathaniel's network. It appears in 3 of the Hartwell transfers. A silence. I know, Colton said. Your family lost 40 acres. My mother lost 40 acres, he said. I was 17. She had been running the ranch alone for 2 years after my father died. She didn't understand what had happened until it was too late, and by then the transfer had been recorded, and the land had already moved on to a secondary buyer, and there was. He stopped. Something moved through him, controlled quickly, but not quite quickly enough for her to miss it. There was nothing she could do, no one she could go to. No one who thought it mattered enough to help a widow with a land dispute. Eliza sat very still. She understood now. She understood the yes he had given her at his kitchen table, the unhesitating, unqualified, immediate yes of a man who had been waiting 8 years for the chance to do the thing nobody Ty had done for his mother. It was not charity, it was not even kindness exactly. It was something older and more personal than either of those things. You knew it was Nathaniel, she said, when you turned him down twice for those land arrangements. You already knew, I suspected, Colton said. I didn't have proof. I've been suspicious for years, but I didn't have a path to anything solid. He looked at her across the table. You brought me the path. She felt the weight of that settle over her. Colton, don't, he said, not harsh, just firm. Don't apologize, don't thank me again. We're past that. She closed her mouth, looked at the letter, looked at the documents spread across the table. Western Grazing Associates gives us the connection, she said, because she was her father's daughter, and her father's daughter did not sit still when there was work to do. Your family's transfer, plus the Hartwell transfers, plus whatever else Aldgate has documented, if they all flow through the same holding companies, that's not coincidence. That's a pattern. That's the kind of pattern a county attorney can take to a full investigation, not just a guardianship hearing. Yes, Colton said. This changes the scope, she said. Yes. Are you ready for that? A full investigation means this goes well beyond the hearing. It means your family's loss becomes part of a public record. It means Eliza, he used her given name for the first time. She noticed, I've been ready for 8 years. I just didn't have anyone to stand next to. The morning came up slow and gray, and they were both still at that table when it did. Colton rode to town at first light. Eliza sent the telegram to James Whitfield in Billings, brief, factual, urgent, the way her father had taught her to write in situations where every word had to carry its full weight. Then she sat down with the documents again and began constructing a formal written summary of the evidence chain, organized in the precise sequential order that Voss would need to present it effectively. She was an hour into it when she heard a horse coming up the road to the ranch. Not Colton. Too soon for Colton. She went to the window. Looked out. It was Margaret Holt, the banker's wife. A woman who had known Eliza's father for 20 years and who moved through Willow Creek's social world with the careful authority of someone who understood exactly how much influence she possessed and deployed it with surgical precision. Eliza felt a complicated mix of things. Margaret Holt was not precisely an enemy. But she was not an ally Eliza had counted on, and her arrival here, unannounced, at 8 in the morning, did not feel like a social call. She opened the front door before Margaret had finished dismounting. "Mrs. Holt," she said. "Eliza." Margaret tied her horse and walked to the porch with the brisk purposefulness of a woman who had something to say and intended to say it without preamble. "May I come in?" "Of course." Eliza poured coffee without being asked. Margaret sat at the kitchen table and looked at the documents spread across it with an expression that was not surprise. "You've been busy," Margaret said. "Yes, ma'am. So's your uncle." Margaret wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. "He came to see my husband last night. Very late. Gerald was not pleased about the hour, but your uncle is not a man who notices when he's not welcome." Eliza sat down slowly. "What did he want?" "He wanted Gerald to call in the note on your father's ranch." Margaret's voice was steady, the voice of a woman delivering information she found distasteful but necessary. "There is a mortgage note on the Hartwell property, taken out 3 years ago. Your father borrowed against the east pasture to fund a cattle purchase. Gerald holds the note. Your uncle wanted Gerald to declare it immediately due." Eliza went cold. She had known about the note. Of course she had known. She had gone through every piece of her father's financial paperwork after his death. The note was not due for another 14 months. It was a standard arrangement, good terms. Her father had been ahead on the payments. But if the bank called it due immediately, if Gerald Holt decided the estate represented an uncertain credit risk, she would have 30 days to produce the full amount, and she did not have the full amount. And without the ranch as collateral, she would lose whatever legal standing she had gained. It was elegant. It was the move of a man who had been doing this for a long time and knew exactly how to use every tool available to him. Gerald didn't agree, Margaret said. "I want to be clear about that. My husband is a banker and a businessman, and he conducts himself accordingly, but he is not a dishonest man. And what your uncle was asking was," she paused, chose her word with care, "irregular." Gerald told him no, Eliza breathed. However, Margaret continued, and Eliza felt herself tighten again. "Your uncle also made a call on Judge Harlan last night, after he left the bank. I know this because the Harlan house is 2 streets from ours, and Charlotte Harlan mentioned it to me this morning at the well." Eliza looked at her steadily. "What did he want with the judge?" Charlotte didn't know. She said her husband came to bed troubled. That's her word, troubled. A judge troubled the night before a hearing he was scheduled to preside over. Eliza set down her cup. Her mind was moving fast now, pulling the implications out and laying them side by side. "Mrs. Holt," she said, "why are you here? You could have sent a note." Margaret looked at her. The careful social armor shifted just slightly, and underneath it was something older and more direct. "I knew your father for 22 years, she said. "He was an honest man in a world that does not always reward honesty. When he died, I sat in that church, and I thought there should be more people willing to say so publicly." She paused. "I am telling you this in person, because I thought you should hear it in person, from someone who is willing to sit in front of you and say it. Your uncle has been in this county a long time, and people are afraid of him, and most of them are afraid in quiet ways that they don't examine too closely." She straightened slightly. "I am 61 years old, and Gerald is 64, and we have built our life in this town, and I think it's past time someone with standing said plainly where they stood." Eliza looked at this woman who she had known as a peripheral presence her entire life, the banker's wife, correct and composed, moving through social events with a careful propriety, and saw, maybe for the first time, who she actually was. "Will you testify," Eliza said at the hearing, "about my father's character? About my uncle's approach to Gerald last night?" A pause. "Yes," Margaret Holt said, "I will. Colton came back at midday. He walked in the door and read Eliza's face immediately. He had that quality she'd noticed of taking in information through the same channels other people used for conversation and said, "What happened?" She told him, all of it. Nathaniel's approach to Gerald Holt. The judge, Margaret's offer to testify. He sat down. Was quiet for a moment. The judge, he said, yes. Harlan's been on that bench 20 years, Colton said. He's not a corrupt man, but he's a careful one. If your uncle applied pressure, he might look for a reason to dismiss before it gets to testimony, Eliza said. A procedural issue, a question about the validity of some filing. Or he recuses, Colton said. She looked at him. If Harlan recuses himself, Colton continued slowly, the case goes to the circuit judge out of Billings. Judge Carmody. He looked at her. I know Carmody. He has no relationship with your uncle. How do you know Carmody? Cattle dispute 4 years ago. Boundary question with a neighbor. Carmody handled it. Colton paused. He's a fair man. More than fair. He doesn't like local influence in his courtroom. Eliza was thinking, if my uncle pressured Harlan, she said, and we can demonstrate that pressure even suggested we could request the recusal ourselves. Before the hearing starts. Force the issue. It's a risk, Colton said. If Harlan feels accused of something he didn't actually agree to do, he could take it badly. A judge who feels his integrity's been questioned doesn't always respond the way you'd hope. What's the alternative? Let Harlan preside with my uncle's conversation sitting in the room with him. No, Colton said. No, I'm not saying that. They looked at each other. We need to know what Nathaniel actually said to him, Eliza said. Before we decide. Yes, can you talk to Harlan directly? A pause. I can try. Harlan and I aren't close, but we have a professional history. He's bought cattle from me twice. He's a man who respects a direct approach. Then go, she said. Colton stood up, picked up his hat. While you're gone, Eliza said, I'll finish the written summary for Voss. And I need to look at whether there are any other documents in your cabinet that reference Western Grazing Associates or any of the other holding companies. He was already at the door. Colton, he stopped, turned. Be careful what you say to Harlan, she said. We can't afford to make an enemy of him if we don't have to. I know how to talk to judges, Colton said. She almost smiled. I'm beginning to understand that you know how to do most things. Something passed through his expression, not quite the ghost of amusement she'd seen before, but something in the same direction, something warmer. Then he put his hat on and left. She was deep in the cabinet, had gotten all the way to a box of records from 1,875 when she found it. She almost missed it. It was tucked inside a ranch ledger from 1,876, folded small, the kind of paper that gets pressed between pages, not because it belongs there, but because someone put it somewhere temporarily, and then forgot it. She opened it, read it again. It was a receipt. A payment receipt formally written from Western Grazing Associates. Dated July 1876. For a land transaction. And the signature at the bottom. She'd been looking at Nathaniel Crow's signature in fraudulent documents long enough to know its sight. Now was unmistakably his. Not a holding company representative, not a subsidiary name. Nathaniel Crow, his own hand, his own signature, signing a payment receipt that connected him personally and directly to Western Grazing Associates. Every other document in their chain connected Nathaniel through layers, through agents, through company names, through secondary records. This was direct, first person, signed. She sat on the floor of the front room with the receipt in her hands and understood that she was holding the single most important piece of paper in their entire case. This was not a document that could be explained away as an indirect association. This was Nathaniel Crow's signature on a Western Grazing Associates document. The same Western Grazing Associates that had accepted fraudulent transfers of both Hartwell land and Lone Creek land. He had been careful for years, and this one receipt, one piece of paper tucked into someone else's ledger and forgotten, had undone all of it. She stood up, checked the time. Colton had been gone an hour. She went back to the table and laid the receipt beside the other documents and looked at it and felt something move through her that was not triumph. Triumph felt too easy. Too uncomplicated for what this was, but something adjacent to it. Something with more weight. The particular satisfaction of someone who has believed something was true for a very long time and has finally held the proof in their hands. "You should have been more careful, Uncle." She heard hoofbeats. Dude went to the window. Colton was back, but he was not alone. Riding beside him was a man she had never seen younger, perhaps 30, with the careful professional dress of someone who worked in an office and the slightly urgent posture of someone who had been told to hurry. She met them at the door. "This is Daniel Preswick," Colton said, dismounting. "He works for Judge Harlan." Preswick was already off his horse, already reaching into his coat. "Mrs. Reeves," he said, "Judge Harlan asked me to bring this to you personally." He held out an envelope. She took it, opened it. The letter inside was short. 4 sentences in an old man's careful script, Mrs. Reeves. "I have this morning received information that creates a conflict in my ability to preside over tomorrow's hearing without the appearance of partiality. I am therefore recusing myself from the matter and requesting that Circuit Judge Carmody preside in my place. Judge Carmody has been notified and has agreed. I hope this action reflects my continued commitment to the integrity of this court." She read it twice, then she looked up at Colton. "Harlan recused himself," she said. "I know," Colton said. He had clearly already read it. "Voluntarily, before I even had the chance to raise the issue." "What did you say to him?" Colton looked at her steadily. "I told him I hoped the conversation he'd had the previous evening hadn't been one he'd regret. I told him I said it as a man who respected his court and wanted to see it remain something worth respecting." A pause. He was quiet for a long time. Then he asked Preswick to prepare the letter. She looked at the letter, looked at Colton. "He's an honest man," she said. "My uncle miscalculated." "Your uncle has spent a long time working with people who aren't honest," Colton said. "He's lost the ability to accurately identify the ones who are." She thought about that. Thought about all the calculations Nathaniel had made, the careful, long-term, patient maneuvering of a man who was very good at his particular craft, and how he had so completely failed to account for the variable of people who simply would not bend. Colton, Harlan, Margaret Holt, Aldgate, even Gerald Holt, who had refused a request he found irregular. Her uncle had spent 20 years building influence over the people who could be influenced. He had never adequately planned for the ones who couldn't. "I found something," she said, "while you were gone." She led him inside, showed him the receipt. Colton picked it up. Read it again, set it down." He was quiet for a moment. "Where was this?" he said. "In the 1876 ledger, tucked in the middle." "My father's ledger," Colton said. "Yes." He looked at it for another long moment. "He came here," Colton said. "Not a question. More like something he was working out, a piece of old history resolving into new shape. At some point in 1876, someone from Western Grazing Associates came to Lone Creek to complete a transaction, and they produced a receipt with Nathaniel's signature on it. And my father put it in the ledger the way he put everything, every paper, every receipt, because that's how he managed his records." "Your father kept it," Eliza said. "He probably didn't know what it meant. He just kept it because it was a document." Colton set the receipt down very carefully on the table, as though it were something that might break. "He didn't know," Colton said quietly, "and my mother didn't know. They just kept doing what they'd always done, which was trust the paperwork and trust the people who brought it, and Nathaniel." He stopped. Eliza did not say anything. She understood that there were some things you did not try to speak over. Colton stood there with both hands flat on the table, looking at the receipt, and then he straightened, and his expression settled back into its habitual steadiness. But she saw she was learning his face. She realized. In the way you learned the face of someone whose company you occupied consistently, she saw what was underneath it. 8 years of a particular kind of grief, the kind that comes from injustice rather than loss. The harder kind because it has a target, and the target has a name. "Tomorrow," she said. "Tomorrow," he said. "Judge Carmody. Our documents, Aldgate's testimony, Margaret Holt's testimony." And this she touched the receipt. "This is the one he doesn't know we have." Colton looked at her. You want to hold it. Present it at the hearing. Last, she said. Everything else first, build the case. Let his attorney try to counter and then this. When he thinks he's found the holes and argued them closed. Colton was quiet for a moment. That's how your father would have done it, he said. He said it simply as a statement of fact, and she felt it land in her chest, like something settling into place. Yes, she said, it is. That evening, Eliza sat at the kitchen table and wrote a letter to her father. She had not allowed herself to do this since his death. It had felt too close to something she could not afford to feel, but tonight she wrote it. Long all of it. What had happened, what she had found, who had stood beside her. She wrote about Colton. She wrote, he's not what people say, Papa. He's not cold, he's just careful with what matters. The way you were careful with land. The way you taught me to be careful with truth. She folded the letter and did not address it to anywhere. She put it in her coat pocket beside the marriage certificate and the receipt with her uncle's signature. Outside, the night had come down full and quiet over Lone Creek Ranch. Somewhere in the dark, the cattle moved. The house breathed around her. From down the hall, she could hear the faint, familiar sounds of another person present in the same building, a door, a floorboard, the small sounds of someone who was also awake, also thinking, also preparing. She was not alone. The thought arrived without drama. Just a fact, simple and extraordinary at once. She was not alone in this fight. She had not been alone since 3 a.m. 2 days ago, when she had burned her uncle's letter to ash and ridden 11 miles in the dark toward the only name she could think of that mattered. She pressed her hand flat against the table. Tomorrow, she thought. Tomorrow we end this. The hearing was scheduled for 10 a.m. At 7:45, Eliza was dressed and at the table with coffee when Colton came in from the barn and said, without preamble, Aldgate's boarding house was broken into last night. She stood up. Is he hurt? No, he'd been warned after what you said. He took precautions. He wasn't in his room. Colton's voice was entirely controlled, which she had learned meant he was angry. But his bag was searched. His papers were gone through. The copies of the documents, he had them on his person, Colton said. He's fine. Documents are fine. He paused, but someone wanted us to know they tried. That's the message. She understood. The break-in was not just a theft attempt. It was a demonstration. We can reach you. We can reach the people around you. You are not as safe as you think. He's trying to rattle us, she said. An hour before the hearing. Yes, Colton said. She picked up her coffee cup. Set it down, picked up her coat. Then let's not be rattled, she said. They rode into Willow Creek at 8:30, and the town was already aware that something significant was happening. People moved with that particular quality of a community, preparing to witness not quite crowds, but more people on the street than usual, more faces at windows, more conversations that stopped when Eliza and Colton passed. She rode with her back straight and her eyes forward, and the saddlebag containing her father's documents, and the receipt, separately folded, in her inside coat pocket, pressed against her side. Outside the courthouse, Chester Finley stood with 2 men she didn't recognize, his face arranged in the careful blankness of an attorney, before a proceeding. He looked at her as she dismounted. She looked at him. Neither of them said anything. She and Colton walked up the courthouse steps. Behind them, she heard Aldgate's voice. He had arrived separately, as they'd planned, and then Margaret Holt's, clear and composed, greeting someone she knew. At the top of the steps, Colton held the door. She walked through it. And she thought, my father built something real, and I am going to prove it. The courtroom was already half full when they walked in. Eliza had been inside this room twice before in her life, once as a child, when her father had a boundary dispute with a neighboring rancher, and once 3 years ago when she had accompanied him to witness the signing of a water rights agreement. Both times the room had felt large and formal in the way of official places, slightly intimidating in the particular way that rooms designed to make decisions about people's lives always were. Today it felt smaller, compressed by the number of bodies in it, by the quality of attention in the air, by the specific tension of a proceeding that everyone present understood was not a routine matter. She walked to the plaintiff's table. She was the respondent to Nathaniel's petition, which meant she sat on the right and set her bag down, and took her seat and did not look at her uncle. She felt him, though. He was already seated at the petitioner's table across the aisle, with Chester Finley beside him and another attorney she didn't recognize on Finley's other side. 3 men at one table, the visual weight of resources, of preparation, of confidence. Colton sat directly behind her in the gallery, close enough that she could have reached back and touched his arm. She did not, but she knew he was there. Aldgate was 3 rows back. Margaret Holt was beside him. Harrison Voss, the county attorney, was in a chair to the side of the room with a leather portfolio across his knees, which was not a position she had been entirely certain he would occupy this morning. He had come. That mattered. The bailiff called the room to order at 5 minutes past 10, and Circuit Judge Edmund Carmody entered from the side door and took his seat on the bench. Eliza studied him. Colton had told her, fair, direct, no patience for local influence in his courtroom. He was perhaps 60, with a broad, weathered face and small eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles that moved across the room with the systematic attention of a man who read people the way other people read documents. He sat, arranged his papers, looked up. "We are convened on the matter of a petition for legal guardianship over the estate of the late Robert Hartwell, filed by Nathaniel Crowe," Carmody said. His voice was unhurried but carried without effort. "I am Circuit Judge Edmund Carmody, sitting in for Judge Harlan at his request. I have reviewed the petition and the respondent's preliminary filing." He looked over his spectacles at the room. "We will proceed. Mr. Finley, you represent the petitioner?" "Yes, Your Honor," Finley said, rising smoothly. "Mr." Carmody looked at Eliza's side. Eliza stood. "Your Honor, Eliza Reeves, appearing on my own behalf. I am an attorney-trained respondent, and I am prepared to represent myself in this matter." She had not been attorney-trained. Not formally, women could not be admitted to the Montana bar in 1882. But she had studied every piece of legal correspondence her father had ever received, had read Blackstone's commentaries cover to cover at 16, had memorized the relevant statutes on property and estate law. And she had spent 2 days preparing exactly what she intended to say and how she intended to say it. She would not be easily managed. Carmody looked at her for a moment. "Very well," he said. "Mr. Finley, the petition." Finley rose and presented the guardianship petition with the polished efficiency of a man who had done this before. He spoke about Eliza's age, her lack of business experience, the complexity of estate management, the necessity of proper oversight for the protection of the estate's value. He spoke about Nathaniel Crowe's long presence in the community, his business acumen, his genuine familial concern. He used words like well-being and stewardship and responsibility, and he arranged them in the careful, sympathetic architecture of someone who had built the argument over several weeks to sound as reasonable as possible. It did sound reasonable. Eliza sat and listened and registered exactly how reasonable it sounded and kept her expression level and made notes. When Finley sat down, Carmody looked at Eliza. "Mrs. Reeves," he said. "Your Honor," she said. "The petition before this court characterizes me as someone in need of management. I would like to begin by demonstrating that the characterization is inaccurate." She picked up the first document from her stack. "This is a summary of the Hartwell estate's financial position as of my father's death. I prepared it myself over the 3 weeks following his passing. It documents assets, liabilities, pending contracts, cattle records, and projected revenue for the next fiscal year. I can answer any question about any line in it." She set it on the clerk's table. "This is not the work of someone who cannot manage her own affairs." She heard a small sound from somewhere in the gallery. Not exactly murmuring, more like a collective intake. Carmody took the document, read it with the same systematic attention he had given the room when he entered. He turned pages. He went back to the first page. He looked up at Eliza. "You prepared this yourself," he said. "Yes, Your Honor." He made a note. "Continue. The petitioner has characterized his interest as familial concern," Eliza said. "I intend to demonstrate to this court that his actual interest is in the estate's land, and that his Methods in land from others in this territory have not always been consistent with legal or ethical standards. Finley was on his feet. Objection, Your Honor. The respondent is making allegations entirely outside the scope of a guardianship proceeding. Sit down, Mr. Finley, Carmody said, without heat. I'll determine the scope. He looked at Eliza. You have evidence to support that characterization? Yes, Your Honor. Then we'll hear it in proper order. Proceed with your case. Finley sat down. At the petitioner's table, Eliza's uncle shifted in his seat. She had not looked at him yet. She had made a deliberate choice not to. She would look at him when the time was right. She called Aldgate first. Thomas Aldgate took the witness chair with the careful movement of a man who was aware that this moment had been a long time coming and did not intend to waste it. He stated his name, his former occupation, his years in the territory. He spoke clearly and without visible nervousness, and Eliza walked him through his testimony the way her father had walked her through difficult terrain, one careful step at a time, each foot placed firmly before the next one moved. Aldgate described the land agent business in the territory in the 1870s. He described the standard processes for property transfers, the document requirements, the filing procedures. He described the first time Nathaniel Crow had approached him about a transaction he found irregular. He described the second approach. He described the specific language Nathaniel had used. She'd asked him to reconstruct it as closely as possible, and Aldgate had a good memory and used it. He said to me, Aldgate told the court, looking directly at Carmody, that the documentation would hold up to any reasonable scrutiny. Those were his words, any reasonable scrutiny, and I said to him that I wasn't in the business of producing documentation designed to withstand scrutiny rather than documentation designed to accurately reflect reality. And he looked at me for a moment and then he said, I suppose we don't need to work together then, Thomas, and he left. A silence in the courtroom. And the transactions you refused, Eliza said, did they proceed through other channels? Yes, Aldgate said, they did. I later saw the filed records. The transfers went through. The documentation held up to reasonable scrutiny. He paused. Apparently, Carmody had been writing steadily throughout. Finley's cross-examination of Aldgate was careful and methodical. He questioned the reliability of decade-old memory. He questioned whether Aldgate's refusal to participate might indicate a personal grievance rather than principled objection. He questioned the specificity of Aldgate's recollection of the exact words used. Aldgate answered each challenge with the same measured steadiness. He did not get defensive. He did not overreach. He simply answered what was asked and stayed close to what he knew. When Finley sat down, Eliza looked at Carmody. Your Honor, I'd like to introduce documentary evidence. Present your documents. She began with the fraudulent deed from March 1879. She walked Carmody through the signature analysis, the formation of the R, the particular pen pressure, the contrast with authentic Hartwell signatures on documents she'd brought for comparison. She introduced it methodically and without drama, letting the paper speak. Then she introduced the second document, the third, the fourth. With each one, she explained the holding company structure, Western Grazing Associates, Montana Land Holdings, Prairie Development Trust. She showed how the same names and structures appeared repeatedly across different transactions, different families, different years. She was on the fourth document when she saw Finley lean toward the second attorney and say something very quietly. The second attorney leaned back. Finley's jaw tightened. They hadn't expected the volume of documentation. They had expected one or two items that could be individually challenged. They had not expected a chain. Carmody looked up from the documents. Mrs. Reeves, these holding companies you're alleging the petitioner had personal involvement. Yes, Your Honor. On the basis of these documents, you can demonstrate his connection to these entities? Through these documents, indirectly, I have additional evidence of a more direct connection. She paused. I'd like to call my next witness first. Margaret Holt took the witness chair with the composed authority of a woman who had been the most socially certain person in any room she'd entered for 30 years. She testified about Nathaniel's late-night visit to her husband. She was precise about the date, the hour, the request. She was precise about Gerald Holt's refusal. "Your husband declined," Carmody said. "He did, Your Honor. He told Mr. Crow that calling a current note under those circumstances would be irregular, and that his bank did not operate on the basis of personal requests of that nature." She folded her hands in her lap. "Gerald takes the integrity of his institution very seriously." "And why are you testifying to this, rather than your husband?" "Gerald is in Billings at a banking conference," Margaret said. "He left 2 days ago. He does not know about this morning's proceeding. I made the decision to testify myself because I believe this court should know what was asked." She paused. "I am prepared to swear to every word of it." From across the aisle, Chester Finley rose smoothly. "Your Honor, with respect, the witness is characterizing a private conversation she was not present for." "She stated her husband relayed it to her," Carmody said. "Hearsay, Your Honor. I'm aware of hearsay, Mr. Finley. I've been a judge for 18 years. Carmody looked at him evenly. "The witness's testimony is noted, and I'll weigh it accordingly." "Sit down." Finley sat down. Eliza looked at the petitioner's table for the first time. Nathaniel Crow sat with the careful stillness of a man maintaining control by effort. He was a handsome man. He had always been a handsome man. Well-dressed, well-groomed, with the particular kind of good looks that come from knowing how to present oneself. She had grown up watching people respond to that presentation, watching them trust it. He was looking at the middle distance, not at her. His expression was composed, but his right hand resting on the table was not entirely still. He knew, she thought. He knew the ground was shifting under him, and he was calculating the way he always calculated. The long, patient, strategic way what move remained. She was about to show him that the move he hadn't calculated for was already on the table. "Your Honor," she said, "I have one final piece of evidence." She reached into her inside coat pocket and produced the receipt. Unfolded it carefully, set it on the table. "This is a payment receipt dated July 1876, she said. "It documents a payment made in connection with a land transaction." "It was produced by Western Grazing Associates," she paused. "It is signed by Nathaniel Crow, his personal signature. Not a company representative, not an agent, the petitioner himself." The quality of the silence in the courtroom changed. It was not dramatic silence, the kind you heard in stories. It was something more specific and more complete, the silence of a room full of people who were all simultaneously recalibrating. Finley was on his feet before she'd finished the sentence. "Your Honor, sit," Carmody said. Finley sat. Carmody picked up the receipt. Looked at it for a long time. He was a thorough man. "Where did you obtain this?" he asked. "It was found in the ranch records of Lone Creek Ranch," Eliza said. "Records kept by Colton Reeves's father dating to 1876. It was produced in connection with a transaction involving Lone Creek property, a transaction that, based on the other documents before this court, we believe was connected to the same fraudulent scheme." "The petitioner's signature," Carmody said. "You've compared this to authenticated examples of his signature?" "Yes, Your Honor." She produced the comparison documents, 2 letters Nathaniel had sent to her father that were in the estate files, both signed, both dated. "These are letters written by the petitioner to my father. The signature matches." Carmody looked at the receipt. Looked at the comparison letters. Made a note so long it took him nearly a full minute to write. Nathaniel Crow spoke. He had not spoken yet throughout the entire proceeding. He had let Finley manage everything, the way he always let carefully selected people manage things on his behalf. But now he spoke quietly, without rising, directed at Finley. "Object to the foundation," he said. Finley stood immediately. "Your Honor, there is no established foundation for these documents. The respondent has not demonstrated chain of custody, has not provided expert authentication, has not." "The chain of custody is straightforward," Eliza said. "The document was in a sealed box of ranch records that has been in the same location since 1876. I can provide the ranch owner as a witness to attest to the record's condition and provenance." She looked at Carmody. the ranch owner being Colton Reeves, who is present in this courtroom. Call him, Carmody said. Colton took the witness chair. He was, Eliza thought, watching him, exactly himself. No more and no less than he always was, contained, direct, entirely unintimidated by the formality of the room or the weight of what was happening in it. He answered Carmody's questions about the ranch, records the way he answered every question, which was plainly and without embellishment. These records have been in your family's possession since 1876, Carmody said. Yes, Your Honor. My father kept every document connected to the ranch's operation. It was his habit and his practice. I continued it after I inherited the property. The box containing the receipt in question, it had not been opened recently, before Mrs. Reeves found this document? Not since I moved into the house 8 years ago, Colton said. I went through the records systematically at that time. I didn't find this document then. I believe it was pressed inside a ledger and was not visible without removing the ledger from the box and opening it completely. So it was genuinely undiscovered until now. Yes, Your Honor. Finley rose for cross-examination. He tried 3 different angles, questioning the completeness of Colton's knowledge of the records, questioning whether the document might have been placed there more recently, questioning the chain of possession. Colton answered each one with the same unadorned precision. He did not get pulled. He did not get flustered. He simply answered what was asked with what was true. Finley sat down looking like a man who had pushed against a wall and found it more solid than anticipated. Carmody called a 15-minute recess. In the corridor outside the courtroom, Eliza stood with Colton and Voss and said nothing for a full 30 seconds, because sometimes you needed 30 seconds to simply breathe. He's going to rule in your favor, Voss said quietly. On the guardianship petition, Eliza said yes. On the petition, certainly, Voss paused. The broader question is whether he refers the fraud matter for investigation. Will he? Colton asked. Voss looked at the courtroom door. Carmody is not a man who ignores what's in front of him, he said. And what's in front of him right now is significant. From further down the corridor came the sound of raised voices. Controlled but raised. Eliza turned. Chester Finley had Nathaniel Crow against the wall at the far end of the hallway, and whatever Finley was saying to his client he was saying with the urgent, compressed intensity of an attorney who understood that things had just gone catastrophically sideways and was trying to manage a client who was not taking that news calmly. She could not hear the words. She could see Nathaniel's face. And for the first time in the entire proceeding, the entire 2 days, she saw something in her uncle's expression that she had never seen there before. Not anger, not calculation, not the practiced control of a man who believed he was managing a situation. Fear, real fear, the kind that came from understanding that the ground you had built your life on was no longer solid, and that there was no further maneuver, no remaining strategy, no card left in the hand. She looked at him for a long moment. She had expected to feel something harder at this sight. Satisfaction, even anger. But what she actually felt was something quieter, and as had her the particular grief of recognizing that a person who should have been something decent had made themselves, over the course of years, into something that now stood against a hallway wall, terrified of the truth it had accumulated. He had done this to himself and to her father, and to 6 families. And to a 17-year-old boy watching his widowed mother lose 40 acres to a signature that wasn't real. She turned away. The recess ended, they returned to the courtroom. Carmody took his seat and arranged his papers and looked at the room. I have reviewed the petition and the respondent's evidence, he said. I will address the petition first. The purpose of a guardianship proceeding is to protect the interests of someone unable to protect their own. The respondent, Eliza Reeves, has demonstrated in this courtroom today a level of legal and financial competence that renders the petition's central premise without foundation. She is not incapable. She is not in need of management. She is a woman who prepared a comprehensive estate financial summary in 3 weeks while grieving, who organized and presented a substantial evidentiary case, and who conducted herself throughout this proceeding with intelligence and precision. He paused. He was not a man who editorialized often, Eliza suspected, but when he did, it was deliberate. The petition is dismissed. 3 words, the petition is dismissed. She heard the gallery react a collective exhale, a murmur, someone in the back making a sound that was very close to a small exclamation of satisfaction. She sat very still and felt the words land. Regarding the evidentiary matter, Carmody continued, and the room went quiet again. I am referring the documents presented today to the county prosecutor's office for investigation into potential fraud in connection with property transactions in this territory. He looked directly at the petitioner's table. Mr. Crow, you are advised that based on the evidence presented today, including a receipt bearing your personal signature connecting you to a corporate entity allegedly used in fraudulent land transfers, you may wish to consult legal counsel about your position going forward. Nathaniel Crow did not move. This court is adjourned, Carmody said. He stood. The bailiff called the room to order and Carmody left through the side door, and then the room broke apart into sound and motion. Eliza sat at the respondent's table for a moment and did not move. She put both hands flat on the table, the way she had done at the kitchen table 2 days ago, and she breathed, and she felt the weeks and the days and the hours of it, the grief, the fear, the work. The 2 days of accumulated extraordinary effort moved through her all at once. The petition is dismissed. Voss appeared at her elbow. I'll begin the formal referral process this afternoon, he said quietly. The prosecutor's office will want all the original documents. You'll need to provide them. I know, she said. I'll have them ready. This will take time, he said. An investigation like this, months, possibly more. I know that too, she said, but it will happen. Yes, Voss said. I believe it will, he paused. Your father would be. I knew Robert Hartwell for 15 years. He would be proud. She looked up at him. Thank you, she said. Voss nodded and stepped away. Margaret Holt was there next, composed as always, but with something warm and genuine underneath it, pressing Eliza's hand briefly between both of her own. Well done, she said simply. Then she too stepped away. Aldgate found her last. He stood in front of her and looked at her with the expression of a man who had set down something heavy and was still adjusting to the new weight of his own body without it. 7 years, he said. I know, she said. Your father deserved better than what happened to him. Yes, she said, he did. Aldgate nodded. His eyes were bright in the way of older men who have given themselves permission finally to feel something they'd been holding back for a long time. He turned and walked toward the door. Eliza stood. She turned around. Colton was still in his seat in the gallery. He was the only one who hadn't moved, hadn't come forward, hadn't spoken. He sat there watching her with those careful dark eyes, and he didn't say anything. She walked to him. She stood in front of him and looked at him, and for a long moment neither of them said a word, because some things did not have words that were adequate to them, and both of them were honest enough to know it. Then Eliza said, She would be proud of you too, your mother. And something happened to Colton Reeves's face. It was not dramatic. It was not the kind of thing that would have been visible from across a room. But she was close enough to see it, the shift in the thing he kept so carefully controlled, the movement behind the steadiness, something that had been locked for 8 years and was now, in the aftermath of this morning, just barely loosened. His jaw moved. He looked at the floor for a moment. Then he looked back up at her. Yes, he said. His voice was very quiet. I think she would. And then, from the petitioner's table from the far side of the now largely empty courtroom, came Nathaniel Crow's voice. She had not expected him to speak to her. She had half expected him to be gone already, removed by Finley's management of the situation, folded away to deal with what was coming in private. But he was still there. Finley was beside him, hand on his arm, saying something urgent in a very low voice. And Nathaniel was not listening to Finley. He was looking at Eliza across the empty room. You think this is over, he said. His voice was steady. Composed. The fear she had seen in the hallway was tucked back behind the performance, but it was still there. She could see it now because she knew to look for it. She looked at him directly. It's over for me, she said. The petition is dismissed. What comes next is between you and the prosecutor's office. Investigations take time, Nathaniel said, years. And I have resources and attorneys and Uncle, Eliza said. The word stopped him. It was the first time she had addressed him that way in the entire proceeding. She said it quietly, without heat, and it landed in the room with a particular weight that she had not entirely anticipated. You spent 20 years building something, she said. And you spent it on this, on taking what belonged to other people. She looked at him steadily. I don't know what my father's land was supposed to give you that you didn't already have. I don't know what 40 acres of Lone Creek grassland was worth to you compared to what it cost you to take it. She paused. But I know what it cost everyone else. Nathaniel stared at her. Finley said, We need to go, Nathaniel. After a moment, Nathaniel Crow looked away from her. He stood. He picked up his hat from the table. He walked toward the door with Finley beside him, and he did not look back. The door opened and closed. Eliza stood in the empty courtroom with Colton and let the silence of it settle around her. He'll fight the investigation, Colton said quietly. I know, she said, it will be long. I know that too. She looked at the empty petitioner's table, at the space where her uncle had been, but he'll fight it without the petition. Without guardianship, without any legal claim to my father's property, she turned. He's on the defensive now. That changes everything. She picked up her bag from the respondent's table. The marriage certificate was in her coat pocket. The receipt was there too, now returned to her by the court clerk after Carmody had examined it. She could feel both of them through the fabric. Colton, she said. He looked at her. I want to go home, she said, and then she stopped because the word had arrived naturally and without any decision on her part, and they both heard it. Home. She had meant her father's ranch, the Hartwell property, where she had grown up, which was hers now without contest. That was what she had meant. But she had said it standing in a courtroom in Willow Creek, at the end of the most important morning of her life, and she had said it to this man, and home had arrived in her mouth without a specific address attached to it, and she thought, oh. Colton held the courtroom door open. Let's go, he said. And they walked out together into the Montana morning, into whatever it was that came next. The ride back from the courthouse was quiet in the particular way that follows something enormous, not the silence of people who have nothing to say, but the silence of people who have too much and are waiting for the right moment to begin. Eliza rode with her back straight and her eyes on the road ahead, and she was aware of Colton beside her in the way she had become aware of him over these 2 days as a specific, steady presence that her body had learned to register the way it registered weather, instinctively, without needing to think about it. She did not examine this awareness. There were more immediate things to attend to. She needed to go to her father's ranch. She had not been back since the morning she had packed her bag and ridden out in the dark 3 days ago now, though it felt like 3 weeks. 3 days since she had stood in that kitchen burning her uncle's letter, and the distance between that woman and the woman, riding through Willow Creek this morning, felt like a geography she could not entirely map. I need to go to my father's property today, she said. I'll take you, Colton said. You don't have to. I'll take you, he said again, not insistent, simply certain. She let it be. They stopped at Lone Creek Ranch long enough to water the horses and collect a few things Eliza needed. She changed out of her courthouse clothes into her working clothes, the practical, worn things she had brought in her bag 3 days ago, and when she came back into the kitchen, Colton was at the table with coffee and a plate of food he had put together without comment. She sat down and ate without arguing, because she was hungry and because she was learning that fighting Colton on practical matters was a waste of energy she could deploy more usefully elsewhere. When she was done, she said, James Whitfield sent a telegram back this morning. Before the hearing, I didn't have a chance to mention it. Colton looked at her. He's coming, she said. He'll be here by tomorrow evening. He doesn't need to testify now, Colton said. No. But I want him to see the documents. He did business with my father for 15 years. He may know things, transactions, arrangements, history that could be useful to Voss's investigation. Colton nodded. Good thinking. Also, she said, and then stopped, because the next part was harder to say than she'd anticipated. I want someone who knew my father to come to the ranch with me. Someone who remembers what it was supposed to be. She looked at her hands on the table. Whitfield knew him well, and you, she stopped again. And me, Colton said quietly. You never met him, she said. But you've been defending what he built for 3 days. I think that counts for something. Colton looked at her for a moment. Then he picked up his cup. Let's go, he said. The Hartwell property was 11 miles in the opposite direction from town, southwest rather than northeast, sitting in a broad, well-watered valley that her father had chosen specifically for the quality of its winter grass. Eliza had grown up on this land. She knew every fence line, every seasonal pattern of the creek, every structural quirk of the barn and the house. She knew it the way you knew a person, not just their surface, but their moods, their particular tendencies, the way they behaved under stress. Riding up to it now, she felt something that was not quite the grief she had been holding back for 3 weeks, but was its close relative. Something that acknowledged loss while refusing to be flattened by it. The house was the same. Of course it was the same. Houses didn't change in 3 days, not even when the people who filled them did. She dismounted at the gate and stood looking at it for a moment. Colton dismounted beside her and also looked at it and said nothing, which was exactly the right response. She opened the gate and walked in. She went through the house room by room. Not frantically, not with the urgent search of someone looking for something specific, but deliberately, the way you walked through a place you were reclaiming, putting your presence back into it, reasserting your right to be there. She opened windows. She checked the kitchen stores. She went to her father's office and stood in the doorway and looked at his desk, the same papers on it that had been there the morning he died, still undisturbed, because she had been the only one with access, and she had not been able to bring herself to move them yet. She crossed to the desk and sat down in her father's chair. She put her hands on the armrests where his hands had rested for 30 years. All right, Papa, she said quietly. I'm here. She sat there for a long moment. Then she stood and went to find Colton, who was in the barn doing a quiet, unsolicited assessment of the cattle records she had left there, the practical, unsentimental attention of a working rancher who understood what needed tending. He looked up when she came in. There are 3 fences on the east boundary that need work before winter, he said. I know, she said. I made a note of it before my father died. We hadn't gotten to them yet. I can send 2 of my men over next week. She looked at him. You don't have to do that, she said. I know I don't have to, he said. She looked at him for a long considering moment. He returned her gaze steadily, the way he returned everything without performance, without maneuvering, without trying to shape her response. Colton, she said, we need to talk about what happens now. He set down the cattle record he was holding. Yes, he said. We do. They sat on the low fence at the edge of the barnyard, side by side, looking out at the east pasture, where 3 of her father's cattle were grazing with the serene indifference of animals who had entirely failed to notice that the world had changed. The petition is dismissed, she said. The immediate threat is gone. The investigation will take time, but Voss is competent and Carmody's referral gives it proper standing. She paused. The legal reason we married no longer exists. No, Colton said. It doesn't. A silence. I want you to know, Eliza said carefully, that I meant what I said when I came to your door 3 days ago. About a clear and honest agreement, about not making claims. She kept her eyes on the pasture. I understand that what you did was extraordinary. I understand that most people would not have done it. And I don't intend to hold you to something you did out of. Eliza, he said. She stopped. He was looking at the pasture too. His profile, close enough that she could see the slight tension in his jaw, the careful way he was choosing what came next. When you came to my door, he said, I told you yes, because someone should have helped my mother. I remember. That was true, he said. It was true and it was the right reason, and I don't regret it. He paused. It was also not the only reason. She turned to look at him. He was quiet for a moment, with the particular quality of a man who is accustomed to living inside silence and is now making a deliberate choice to speak from it. I've been alone a long time, he said, not unhappily. I want to be clear about that I wasn't sitting on that ranch waiting to be rescued from my own life. I made choices and I was at peace with them." Another pause. "But you rode in at 4 in the morning, and you sat across my kitchen table, and you looked at me like I was exactly the person you needed, and you weren't wrong." He stopped. "I noticed that you weren't wrong." Eliza was quiet. "I don't know what this is," Colton said. "I'm not a man who claims to know things before he knows them. But I know that I don't want to end it because the legal necessity is over." He looked at her for the first time in this conversation, directly, the way he always looked at things he was being honest about. That's the truth of it. She held his gaze. She thought about riding 11 miles in the dark toward a name she trusted. She thought about him saying yes before she finished asking. She thought about 3 days of working alongside someone who matched her step for step without being asked, who noticed when she hadn't eaten, who found her father's receipt in a box and understood immediately what it meant, who sat in a courtroom behind her and whose presence she could feel without turning around. She thought about the word home arriving in her mouth without a specific address. "I'm not the easiest person to be around," she said. "I noticed," he said. And there it was again, not quite a smile, but the same neighborhood. Warmer this time. "I have strong opinions about ranch management. I gathered that from the cattle records. I'll want to maintain my father's property independently. I'd expect nothing else." She looked at him. "You're very calm about all of this." "I'm calm about most things," he said. "It's not the same as not caring." She thought about that. About the distinction between the surface of a thing and its content. About how badly she had misread the surface of Colton Reeves before she sat across his kitchen table and actually talked to him. "I'm not going to pretend I have this figured out," she said. "Neither am I. It might be complicated. Figuring out how two people with their own land and their own ways of doing things." "Eliza," he said. "What?" "I'm not asking you to have it figured out," he said quietly. "I'm asking if you want to try." The question was so simple that it took her a moment to adjust to its shape. She had been prepared for complexity, for negotiation, for the careful mapping of terms and conditions. She had not been prepared for something that arrived this plainly. She looked at the east pasture, at the cattle moving slowly through the grass. At her father's land, which was hers now, clear and free and belonging entirely to itself. "Yes," she said, just the one word. She said it the way he had said it 3 mornings ago across a kitchen table, without preamble, without condition. His breath shifted beside her, barely, just enough. "All right then," he said. And somehow that the simplicity of it, the two of them sitting on a fence at the edge of a barnyard on a Thursday morning in late summer, saying yes to something they didn't have a full name for yet, was the most significant conversation of either of their lives. They were still working through the ranch records when James Whitfield arrived the following evening. Eliza had forgotten, in the press of the preceding days, how much Whitfield had simply loved her father. She had thought of him as a business partner, which he was, but when he rode up to the Hartwell property and saw her standing at the door, the expression on his face was the expression of a man who had been carrying grief and was now in a place where it was safe to set it down. He was a large man, Whitfield, broad and gray-haired, with a direct manner that her father had always said was the best kind of honesty, the kind that didn't know how to be anything else. He embraced her with the unself-conscious warmth of someone who had known her since she was 12 years old, and then he held her at arm's length and looked at her face. "You look like him," he said. "You always did, but right now," he shook his head. "Tell me what happened, all of it." She told him all of it. Whitfield listened without interrupting, which was a quality she had always valued in him. He sat at her father's kitchen table and listened, and his expression moved through a sequence of responses: recognition, outrage, grim satisfaction at the hearing's outcome, and when she was done he was quiet for a long moment. "Western Grazing Associates," he said. "Yes, I saw that name," Whitfield said slowly. "In 1877, in a letter your father received. He mentioned it to me in passing, said he'd had an inquiry from a land company about purchasing some eastern acreage, and he'd turned them down." He looked at her. "I didn't think anything of it at the time. Land companies were always making inquiries." Do you remember anything else about the inquiry? It was in writing, Whitfield said. A formal letter. Your father kept everything. Eliza was already moving toward the filing cabinet in the corner of the office. Colton, who had been sitting quietly at the table throughout, stood and followed her without being asked. It took them 40 minutes. The filing cabinet held 20 years of correspondence, meticulously organized, in the way of a man who understood that paper was the record of reality and treated it accordingly. Eliza went through 1,877 with Colton beside her, reading each document quickly, setting aside anything involving land transactions or company names. She found it in the March 1,877 correspondence, a letter on formal paper from Western Grazing's Associates offering to purchase 40 acres of Hartwell Eastern acreage at a stated price. Professional language, standard inquiry format, signed by Nathaniel Crowe as company representative. 1,877. Her father had received this letter in 1,877 5 years before his death, 2 years before the forged deed that had transferred that same acreage without his knowledge. He had turned it down. She could see from the file that he had drafted a polite refusal and sent it. He had filed the inquiry and forgotten it. He had not known, when he turned down the letter in 1,877, that the land would be transferred anyway 2 years later with his forged signature. He had not known that the man writing to him as a business representative was his own brother-in-law. Eliza set the letter down on the desk and stood very still. He reached out directly, Colton said quietly, in writing. With his own name on it, he was confident, she said. He thought my father would sell. He didn't plan on needing to forge anything, he planned on buying it. When my father refused, he had to change approach. She picked up the letter. This letter establishes his personal connection to Western Grazing Associates 2 years before the forged deed. In his own handwriting, sent to my father, it fills the last gap, Colton said. It fills the last gap, she agreed. She brought it back to the kitchen table and set it in front of Whitfield. He read it again, looked up. He signed this, Whitfield said. He signed it, Eliza confirmed. Whitfield looked at the letter for a long moment. Then he looked at Eliza with an expression that was grief and anger, and something else. Something that looked like the particular clarity of a man who has finally understood the full shape of something he only partially saw when it was happening. Your father trusted him, Whitfield said. He had no idea. I would know. I knew Robert for 30 years. He would have told me if he'd suspected his wife's brother. He didn't suspect, Eliza said. That was what made it work. My uncle relied on trust. He needed people to trust him in order to position himself close enough to do what he did. Whitfield set the letter down. What do you need from me? He said. Your testimony to Voss, she said, about my father's character and his business practices. About receiving this letter in 1,877. About the refusal. And anything else you know from 30 years of working alongside him that speaks to who he was and how he operated. I'll give it, Whitfield said immediately. Whatever you need. However long it takes. He looked at Colton, who he had been introduced to briefly when he arrived, and had been quietly assessing throughout the evening in the way of a man taking the measure of someone new in a situation he cared about. You're the man who married her, Whitfield said. Yes, Colton said. 3 days ago, yes. Whitfield looked at him for a moment. The assessment was direct and uncomplicated, an older man looking at a younger one across a kitchen table, deciding what he thought. Robert would have wanted someone in her corner, Whitfield said finally. He used to worry about that. He told me once that the only thing that frightened him about leaving her the ranch was the idea that she'd be fighting it alone. Colton looked at him steadily. She wasn't alone, he said simply. Whitfield nodded once. The matter was apparently settled to his satisfaction. The investigation that followed was, as Voss had predicted, long. Months unfolded into the fall and then the winter, and Eliza learned something about the particular pace of legal processes, the way they moved in institutional time rather than human time, the way patience was not optional but mandatory. The way the work of justice was often unglamorous and slow, and required the sustained attention of people who were willing to keep pushing, even when the momentum felt gone. She pushed. She provided documents, testified to the county prosecutor, organized evidence into formats that Voss's office could use, tracked down additional records that the investigation needed. She did it alongside running her father's ranch, which she had taken back full possession of the week after the hearing, and was running with a systematic, focused competence that she suspected would have made her father quietly proud. Nathaniel Crow hired 3 attorneys. He challenged the admissibility of documents. He filed motions and counterclaims and procedural objections. And his attorneys were expensive and skilled, and fought for every inch with the resources of a man who had spent 20 years building financial leverage specifically for situations where he needed to fight. But the evidence was what it was: receipt with his signature, letter with his signature, forged deeds with the holding company's fingerprints on them, Aldgate's testimony about direct conversations, Whitfield's testimony about the 1877 letter, and Robert Hartwell's response to it. The chain was too long and too well documented, and too many independent witnesses had contributed to it. By February, the prosecutor's office had filed formal charges. By April, 3 of the 6 affected families had been identified and contacted, and the legal process of restoring their land, complicated by secondary transfers and subsequent ownership, had begun. By June, it became clear that Nathaniel Crow's position was no longer defensible, and that his attorneys had begun advising him of this in the urgent private language of lawyers who were managing a client toward a realistic outcome. He pled in July. Eliza received the news from Voss on a Tuesday afternoon. He came to her father's ranch in person, which told her before he spoke that it was significant. He entered a guilty plea this morning, Voss said. Fraud, multiple counts. He'll serve time, and the estate reclamation process will proceed under court supervision. She sat with this for a moment. The families, she said. The 6 families. The process will take time, Voss said. Some of the land has changed hands multiple times. Full restoration isn't possible in every case, but compensation will be ordered, and what can be returned will be returned. She nodded. And the Lone Creek 40 acres, she said. Voss looked at her, proceeding separately. Given the direct evidence connecting the transaction to the same scheme, the court is treating it as part of the broader case. He paused. It should be returned. Colton Reeves's attorney has been notified. Eliza looked out the window at the east pasture, 40 acres of grassland. A widowed woman's loss, a 17-year-old boy who had watched helplessly. 8 years of a particular kind of grief, with a name attached to it. Coming home, she went to Lone Creek Ranch that evening. Drove the wagon rather than riding, which was slower but felt right for the occasion. She went inside without knocking. She had stopped knocking some months ago, when the ranch had become the kind of place she came and went from with a naturalness that no longer required formal announcement. Colton was at the table with his ranch records. He looked up. She sat down across from him, put the letter from Voss on the table between them. He read it. He set it down. He was quiet for a long moment. With the particular quality of his silences that she had learned to read, this one was the silence of something settling, something resolving, something that had been held in tension for a very long time finally releasing. It's done, she said. Almost, he said. The process. I know the process will take time, she said, but the outcome is determined. He pled. The court is moving. She looked at him steadily. It's done, Colton. He looked at the letter, then he looked at her. And she saw it again, what she had seen in the courtroom, the thing behind the steadiness, the thing he kept so carefully controlled. It was more visible now than it had been then. She had learned his face well enough by now to read what was moving through it. She deserved better, he said quietly. She deserved someone who showed up. Someone did show up, Eliza said. It took 8 years, but someone showed up. He looked at her. You showed up, he said. She held his gaze. We showed up, she said, together. That's how it worked. He was quiet for a moment more. Then he reached across the table and covered her hand with his. It was the first time he had done this without the purpose of practical assistance, not helping her down from a horse, not a formal gesture. Just his hand over hers on the table because he wanted it there. She turned her hand over and let her fingers close around his. They sat like that for a while, in the comfortable, specific quiet of two people who had built something real between them over the course of an extraordinary few months, and were not in any hurry to fill the silence with words it didn't need. Outside, the summer evening moved over the Montana grassland, warm and long and unhurried. There were still things to work out. There would always, Eliza suspected, be things to work out two people with their own land, their own strong convictions about how ranches should be run and decisions should be made. Did not merge into simplicity simply because they had decided to try. She knew that. She was not a woman who confused the desire for something with the ease of it. But she was also her father's daughter, and her father had always said that the most valuable things required the most sustained attention. That the land that gave the most was the land you showed up for every single day, through drought and frost and everything ordinary in between. She intended to show up. The following spring, on a Thursday morning in May, Eliza Hartwell Reeves opened the formal deed to the Hartwell property, reconfirmed, recertified, held in her name without qualification or challenge, and spread it out on the kitchen table at Lone Creek Ranch, which had become by then, in the organic way of things that happen gradually, and then all at once, the place she started most of her mornings. She looked at the deed, at her name on it in the county recorder's careful script, at the legal description of the land her father had built, and that she had fought for, and that no one was ever going to take from her. Colton came in from the barn and poured coffee and looked at the document over her shoulder and said nothing, because he understood that some moments were complete without commentary. Then he set a cup beside her and went to the door and said, "The East Fence crew is here." "Tell them I'll be out in 5 minutes," she said. "You've got 3, he said. "The northwest pasture needs moving by noon." She looked up at him with an expression that was not quite exasperation and not quite amusement, and was somewhere between the two, which was a place she spent a fair amount of time when she was looking at Colton Reeves. He looked back at her with the thing that had stopped being almost a smile sometime in the fall, and had become simply a smile, quiet and specific and entirely his own. She folded the deed and put it in the inside pocket of her work coat, next to the place where she had once carried a marriage certificate and a receipt with her uncle's signature and a letter she had written to her dead father, in the dark. She stood up. She picked up her coffee. She walked out the door and into the morning. She was her father's daughter. She was her own woman. She was the co-owner of a working partnership that encompassed 2 ranches and 1 marriage, and a shared history built in 3 extraordinary days, and everything that had followed the months of legal work, the slow return of justice, the gradual and unannounced arrival of something neither of them had expected to find. She was not running. She had not been running since Qu said yes across a kitchen table and reminded her, without saying the words, that being strong enough to fight alone and choosing to stand with someone else were not the same thing, and that the second one, chosen freely between 2 people who had earned each other's trust, was not weakness. It was the bravest thing either of them had ever done. And it had started with 1 word said plainly, and without hesitation, by a man who understood that sometimes the most powerful thing you could offer another person was simply the certainty of your presence beside them. Yes, just that, and it had been enough to change everything.